Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round, bookworms, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read chapter 17 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Chapter 17 is called Meeting the President. I'm actually recording this video on President's Day. What a cool coincidence. Here we go. We toured for more than 2.5 years. We quickly topped the earnings charts for U.S. entertainers, generating an estimated income of $75 million in ticket sales alone. We won 3 notable American Music Awards that year: Favorite Pop Group, Favorite Adult Contemporary Artist, and Favorite Rock Album for Hell Freezes Over. We were also nominated for 4 Grammys, including Best Pop Album. Not bad for a band of wrinkly senior citizens competing against the likes of Oasis and Michael Jackson. The media control was now all-consuming, and realizing that many reporters asked the same questions, we developed formulaic answers, knowing exactly what to say, or rather what not to say. For live interviews, reporters were told to submit their questions in advance, making it even simpler. We knew what was coming, and could play with it a little, to make it look like off-the-cuff improvisation, when it was actually meticulously rehearsed. Sorry, we weren't the Beatles. They were funny. Some reporters insisted on group interviews, instead of speaking only to Don and Glenn, so we'd all sit around trying to look comfortable with each other, until we were asked a sensitive question, like how we were getting along or why we were charging more than $100 per ticket. If the reporter tried to direct such a question to the rest of us, the gods would immediately interrupt or deflect. Joe, Tim, and I would sit there like ventriloquist dummies, opening and closing our mouths without words of our own to speak. Now that Don and Glenn were both in long-term relationships, the nature of the tour changed dramatically. Suddenly, girlfriends, wives, and children were in tow, along with nannies, personal trainers, Pilates instructors, hairdressers, and tutors, all filling their plush suites. My children were that much older and in school, so if I wanted to spend time with them, I'd have to bring them out for brief visits or fly home to see them, which wasn't always easy. Worst of all, Cody was back in trouble, expelled in his second semester at the San Diego University for poor grades. Susan now had to cope alone with a rebellious teenager who seemed to hate us both. I came home whenever I could and tried my hardest to make Cody realize the mistakes he was making, but I again found myself echoing my father. "What are you doing with your life, son?" I'd ask him. "Don't you know where all this is heading?" He'd look at me the way I looked at Dad, and I knew that I wasn't getting through. "How can I make him see?" I asked Susan, as we both lay awake night after night worrying about our son. "What can I tell him that's any different from what my father and Jerry tried to tell me?" "Maybe he can't," Susan said. Her attitude was to let him get through this wild period in the hope that he'd emerge from it eventually, as I had. Not a day went by when I didn't think of my young son or worry desperately for his future. Jesse, at 19, had rarely, if ever, strayed off the straight and narrow path, but I fought not to make constant comparisons between him and Cody, as my father had done between my brother Jerry and me. Each of my boys was a unique individual, coping with life in his own way. Jesse was a student at San Diego University, dating a lovely girl named Erin, whom he had met in his first week at school. He was eager to carve out a career for himself in the financial business, although he learned how to play saxophone in high school, having added it to his guitar talents. When I heard him on that thing, I wondered if he had made the right choice. Man, he could play. The previous summer I had asked Fred Wilecki at Westwood Music if he could use Jesse's help around the store. Fred had become something of a legend in LA, yet he was still lending out free instruments to struggling hopefuls, as he had once done for me, Bernie, and so many others. Fred put Jesse to work. He was remodeling the store and employed Jesse as a junior laborer to the builders. I loved the idea of my son helping out in a music store, just like I had at Lipham's in Gainesville. Knowing that I was going back out on the road, Jesse asked if he could come with me in some capacity with the crew. My guitar techs were delighted to have a new rookie as their slave. "Work him as hard as you would anyone else," I told them, "and offer him no privileges." He put in the long hours and tough conditions without complaint, traveling and sleeping on the crew bus. One day during rehearsals we were practicing Glenn's song, "The Heat Is On," with a saxophonist and a keyboard player who were trying their best to make up a horn section. It sounded a little wimpy. "Hey Glenn," I suggested, "since Jesse's going to be on the road with us anyway, why not let him play sax on that part too? It won't cost you a cent." Glenn jumped at the chance, and the next day Jesse arrived with his instrument. He was so nervous I thought he might pass out. His eyes were huge, and his hands so sweaty they left imprints on the sax. But within a few days he had learned the parts for 5 songs in the show and was playing them like a pro. On the very first show, he walked behind the guitar section and stood a few feet away from me playing his saxophone. I still savor that moment. All those years of lessons, of driving him to and from band practice, the few times where the hair on my neck stood on end while he learned how to play in tune, and now here he was, my own son, playing in the Eagles with me. I was so proud, I almost forgot what I was supposed to be playing. His girlfriend Erin waited in the wings for him when he came off stage each night and nearly sucked the skin right off his lips. Ah, that first taste of stardom. After a few weeks, Jesse definitely gained a slight swagger. The confidence he gained from being with the Eagles for a while was worth more than any salary he could have earned. When summer ended, though, and he had to return to college, his golden carriage turned back into a pumpkin. "Dad, I've learned something very important from this," he told me on the last day. "The people with the greatest skills make the most money, and the people with the fewest skills make the least." When he returned to campus that fall, his grades jumped from C's to straight A's. I guess sometimes the best lessons aren't learned in the classroom. Later in the tour, my daughter Leah came out with us as well. She and Joe Walsh's daughter Lucy had become inseparable. She and Leah looked like sisters, little blonde bookends, and they had a gas on the road together, shopping, surfing in Hawaii, taking helicopter rides over London, or just standing at the side of the stage during shows, watching their dads strut their stuff. Leah loved to have her own hotel room and order room service and be the daughter of someone famous, not just the offspring of some sweaty old guy in jeans and a checkered shirt who was home all the time tinkering with his old Chevy. I made a personal commitment while we toured that I'd try to do something for a charity in some of the towns we were in, to give something back instead of just taking all the time. My chosen charities usually involve sick children or centers specializing in kids with drug problems. Leah was with Susan and me on the day when we arrived in Toronto, Canada, and were driving from the airport to the Four Seasons Hotel. On our way downtown, we drove by a large building. "Hey," I asked the driver, "what's that?" "Oh, that's a hospital for terminally ill children," he replied. Turning to my daughter, I told her, "Tomorrow, Leah, I want you to go to the mall and fill this car with toys. You choose which toys you think the sick kids would like, and you take them to that hospital and give them to them." With her mom, she did just as I said, and had one of the most meaningful afternoons of her life. "That was great, Dad," she told me when I saw her later that day, her eyes bright. "The kids loved everything we bought them. Can we do it again?" With her encouragement, we repeated the exercise often, and she became so committed to the idea that she even called a number she saw on a television appeal in her hotel room one night and made a monthly pledge to another kids' charity, which I still pay today. I knew then that she would never again take our good fortune for granted, and I don't think she ever has. Hell Freezes Over went on to be a very profitable and successful album, but the carrot that had been dangled in front of us turned out to be much less juicy than some of us had been led to believe. Furthermore, when the video and DVD came out, a large percentage of the camera footage was of Don and Glenn. For much of it, you'd think the Eagles were a two-man band. Even for the introduction of Hotel California, you only see my hands playing it, rarely my face. Joe had more airplay than Timothy or I, presumably because of his own solo status. The black and white mannequins on the miniature stage suddenly made sense. The limelight belonged to the gods, and the gods alone. The feeling was reinforced by the credits on the album. Hotel California was mine. It was my chief claim to fame, and I had written most of the music at my beach house in Malibu. It was my understanding that when it came to the credits, the person who contributed most of the song was listed first, followed in descending order by those who added something later, like lyrics. Thus, on the original Hotel album, the credits read, written by Don Felder, Don Henley, and Glenn Frey. Suddenly, on Hell Freezes Over, the credits changed. After Hotel California, it said, written by Don Henley, Glenn Frey, and Don Felder, relegating me to the final position. Furthermore, not a single song by Bernie Leadon or Randy Meisner appeared on the new album. The classics they had written and contributed so much to, like Witchy Woman, On the Border, Try and Love Again, and Take It to the Limit, had been excluded. Neither of those founding members of the Eagles would earn a penny from our latest success. Faced with such pettiness, the antagonism between us increased. Everything started to become an issue, especially Joe and me larking around on stage with cardboard cutouts and some gimmicky tricks, providing much-needed comic relief, but unintentionally drawing the camera away from the gods. Don would spend hours agonizing over publicity photographs, trying to decide if he looked too old or too wrinkled, or if his hair was just right. These were images for t-shirts or for photos to be signed and given away, not to be etched in stone on Mount Rushmore. We accepted his facetiousness and appreciated that it was sometimes a good thing, both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that he set new standards that we all had to strive to achieve. If you expect greatness of people, they often rise to greatness. The curse was that it all took time and energy. The issue of how many people were on the payroll reared its ugly head once more. Don and Glenn had lackeys around them all the time, personal assistants, secretaries, press agents, attorneys, accountants, and various hired hands, even when they were in L.A. My new guitar tech was hired out of Nashville, where he returned between tour legs. On the road, the homeboys would share Don and Glenn's enormous presidential suites. A constant presence at their side, they would escort them down in the elevator when it was time for the limos to take us to the gig. By contrast, I was given a walkie-talkie and was called up by one of the security people when it was my turn to come down. These might seem trivial and insignificant matters compared to the bigger picture of being back together again and on the road and doing what we did best, but added to the sense of being taken for a ride financially. These individual digs added up, causing a permanent feeling of dissatisfaction and apprehension, like when you're breaking up with someone and everything they do suddenly annoys you. Sometimes I admit I let it eat me up too much inside. It truly was a case of this could be heaven or this could be hell, depending on how I was feeling on any particular day. Mostly I was genuinely delighted to be on the road, playing music with the band that I loved. I'd close my eyes, let go, and play from my heart, which was what I enjoyed doing the most. When I was up there on the stage, I'd try to radiate that purity out of me and my music in a positive force that counteracted all the bull and gave the fans their money's worth for the 3 hours they had us to themselves. The audience just wanted to be entertained. That's what they had paid an exorbitant amount of money for. Behind the scenes, I'd try to work with the gods as much as I could and not let the tensions destroy me. "Just think about the money, Fingers," Don would say, grabbing my arm if he ever saw me getting upset with Glenn. "The music is what it's all about," Joe would remind me. "That and the fans are all that matters." If the stress became too much, I'd take a deep breath, hang out with Joe, have some fun, and try to cool off. Now that he was sober, he had become a computer nerd and a radio ham. All the time he'd have previously devoted to drinking, taking drugs, or playing practical jokes, he now spent tuning in to fellow hams all over the world. You could always tell which room Joe was in, because out on the balcony, some weird, contorted antenna would be set up, and you could hear muffled voices with foreign accents through his bedroom door. Joe and I had already rebonded as friends in the guitar camp to which we had been relegated. He was great at shoring me up. While the new divisions between us and the singers' camp eroded support, confidence, and the willingness to be spontaneous musically or speak our minds, Joe and I grew closer and closer. Without him, Don and Glenn would have sucked all the fun out of what would have been the best time of our lives. Susan was always telling me that I'd never be rid of my stomach problems unless I had accepted things more, and I knew she was right. I already had serious back pain, originally caused by a surfing accident in Malibu and exacerbated by so much time sitting in cars and planes. It had flared up on the road, requiring Glenn to have a doctor flown out to treat me. I also needed a different vehicle from the others, just to be more comfortable. Each cloud has a silver lining, however. I began to have daily sessions with Don's personal Pilates instructor, a wonderfully spiritual woman named Issa Bond, who was already on the tour for him. Issa was in her 70s with the body of a 20-year-old. She corrected my guitar player slump and taught me a great deal about being positive and calm and in touch with my inner self. "You need to relax," she'd tell me in that silky, smooth voice of hers as she adjusted my posture. "There are things you have no control over and which you need to let go. Life is too short to waste it worrying." She was right. The road crew on Hell Freezes Over was one of the best we ever had. They worked hard, tearing down the set at 2 in the morning before riding a bus for 6 hours to the next venue. Their schedule was punishing, and they'd sleep when they could before scrambling to set up the stage for the next show. Meanwhile, we were in 5-star suites and limos and private planes with all the glitz and glamour you can imagine. Usually the crew slept on the bus, but when we stayed in a town for a couple days, they would be put up in a hotel. Previously, they had always stayed in the same place as us, which allowed for a sense of camaraderie and shared experience. We could hang out together after a gig, spend time in each other's rooms, get high, or shoot some pool. When Hell Freezes Over, that changed. Suddenly the band was in the Four Seasons, and the crew was in the Holiday Inn. Among our crew was a man named Bill who handled our wiring and built the synthesizer racks we used. He played good bass and was a great person to have around on the technical side. The crew had just done several shows in a row, finishing one in Vegas and reaching Phoenix in the wee hours of the morning, finally getting to their hotel rooms. Each was given a plastic key card at reception. Exhausted, Bill went up to his room. He swiped his card in the door, but it wouldn't open. They'd given him the wrong code, so he went to a friend's room and called the front desk, but the night porter didn't answer. Frustrated, he went back to his room and kicked the door in. A hotel security guard was called, saw the damage, and contacted Irving. The next thing we knew, Bill had been fired from the tour. The message was, anyone who caused problems, even as understandable as this, was gone. Our press agent, Larry Salters, nicknamed Scoop, had been with us for over 20 years. He was a longtime advisor to Irving, almost part of the furniture. In Germany, Glenn was particularly grumpy. He couldn't buy this particular type of Marlboro cigarettes he smoked, Marlboros in a box. He asked Larry to call the States and have his assistant send some cartons via Airborne Express. The messenger arrived with a package the next day, and Larry literally ran them up to Glenn's room. But Glenn tore open the package and saw that they were soft packs instead of boxes, and I soon learned Larry had been fired. There was nothing Irving or any of us could say, although Irving did rehire Larry much later on. The exercise of power seemed to me to be getting out of hand. Anyone's head could be on the block for no reason. I had seen such behavior many times over the years, and mostly I tolerated it. We'd tell each other, "Let it slide, think about the money." Anything to keep the peace and keep the band together. Older and wiser now, though, I found myself increasingly unable to not only witness the abuse, but take it myself and keep smiling. There were times when I could barely stand to be in the same room as Glenn. I guess he picked up on it because soon he let it be known that I was making him unhappy. As I once told Irving, "Irv, you made that guy too rich, too soon." Trouble was, we were all thrown in together on the road. There were few areas for avoiding each other. To keep explosive confrontation down to a minimum, Irving, who had long ago decided on a policy of divide and conquer, separated us as much as possible. Hotel rooms were chosen on separate floors or several corridors apart. We'd have 5 separate dressing rooms. Gone were the days of a jovial a cappella voice rehearsal in the shower room. The fleet of limos went and was replaced by individual bands, where possible, complete with executive armchair seats, air conditioning, DVDs, cell phones, and blacked-out windows. There'd be enough room in each van for the immediate families, bodyguards, and assistants to travel with each band member. Even the stretch Boeing 737 plane we chartered had separate compartments. You could step out of your own car, walk into the plane, go to your own room, close the door, and wait for a stewardess to bring you refreshments. Rarely would Glenn or Don abandon the comfort zone of their own private compartment to walk into the communal areas and help themselves from the trough with the 30 or so support crew. If they did, there was a clear hierarchy. They had to be served first before anyone else could dig in. Orders would be issued from the private compartments like from the presidential plane. In New Orleans, someone announced, "Don would like the Cajun shrimp from the NOLA restaurant. Please arrange for it to be brought to the plane before we take off." Or in Texas, he'd ask for a special chili or favorite barbecue dish. The rest of us were expected to go along with all these directions and just be grateful for the leftovers. We'd managed to avoid each other completely until the moment when we all had to walk onto stage with a big smile and say, "Hi, we're the Eagles," and pretend that everything was wonderful. It was a lonely, isolating experience, and one that made a complete mockery of how we had started and what the fans thought of us. If they had known what each one of us was thinking as we banged out our methodically rehearsed version of our hit songs, they'd probably have walked out. I can only remember a few times during that whole tour when Glenn and I had a laugh. We had just arrived at a charter airport somewhere like Idaho. I went into the bathroom and was at the urinal when Glenn came in and stood at the next one. I told him a joke, and he told one, and we were having a good time standing there with in our hands. When we were both done and went to wash our hands, Glenn turned to me and said, "You know, Fingers, I wish we could be like this all the time. Why can't we just laugh and have fun together?" I replied, "I don't know, buddy. That was great." Smiling, we walked out of the bathroom together, but within the hour, that sense of carefree friendship and camaraderie was gone. We fell back into our self-assigned roles, dealing with the egos and the struggle for power and control. I'll never really understand why. The passive-aggressive atmosphere was all-encompassing. The message was still clear. If you rock the boat too much, you might just tip yourself out. Remember Bernie and Randy. What was so sad was that it was completely unnecessary because there was never any challenge to dominate the Eagles by anyone other than Glenn, Don, and Irving. The second leg of our box office record-setting tour got underway in Philadelphia in the fall of 1994, but Glenn didn't show up for the sound check. He had not been well for some time, and we suddenly heard that he had been admitted to the hospital for surgery. That show and several after it had to be canceled, beginning a 60-day hiatus. Don called me in my room after I'd heard the news. "What are we going to do with this guy?" he asked, exasperated. "Well, I'm trying to help him by visualization," I said, my eyes closed. "I'm sending Glenn soothing thoughts and a healing white light all around him." I knew from personal experience how painful his condition could be, and I felt genuine sympathy. I sent him a telegram wishing him luck, and he sent one back saying, "That's the stuff." Don was less sympathetic. "You're wasting your time," he snapped. "They're treating the wrong end of that hole." When Glenn was better, the tour resumed. Irving kept tight control of the financial reins, promoting the concerts, selling the t-shirt concessions through his own company, Giant Merchandising, and controlling everything from parking to posters and programs. The considerable income we generated was handed to Irving's on-tour accountant, who then gave it to Los Angeles-based accountants, who divided it among us. Irving placed himself firmly between the box office and the accountants, so that all the I's were dotted and all the T's were crossed. The books perfectly balanced. Whenever I asked to see any financial documentation, though, it was always very informal. I never made an appointment with my lawyers or demanded to see papers as I could have done. Even so, I was often made to feel like a nuisance, as if I was nagging needlessly, when all I was trying to do was to make sure that we were on a level playing field. Because of the way I felt, I found myself constantly questioning my own motives. Was I being too greedy, wanting more when I already had so much? Then I remembered the years of grief in which I had more than earned the right to every penny I was being paid, whether they liked it or not. Don, Glenn, and Irving had originally agreed to an equal partnership. Now they were appointing themselves as primary recipients of the work that everyone had given their lives to for so long. There were uncomfortable echoes of my father's experience at Coppers. He had worked from his early teens to his death in his mid-60s, giving up his nights, weekends, and Sundays to do his very best for that company. He died of heart failure, and the only thing I remember them giving him was a gold watch. I found their ingratitude staggering. If this was going to be the Eagles' last tour, as I suspected it would be, then I had to protect my own interest and those of my children. Timothy and Joe knew that anything they said would be ignored, and although they backed me up in principle and told me privately to go for it, they opted for a quiet life and just took what they were given. Not that I was getting anywhere. Irving would call up between each 6-week tour leg and say, "Don and Glenn have agreed to do 25 more shows on the East Coast from January to April, and you're going to make a bundle. Are you in or not?" There were no more band meetings. This seemed like a dictatorship, and mine was the third phone call after the gods had already agreed. I had read a great deal about abusive relationships, and that's just what I felt like. An abused wife, financially and emotionally dependent on my husband, afraid that he'd dump me if I made too much of a fuss or did something to displease him. I usually held off with Irving's repeated maxim, "You make the music fingers, and I'll take care of the business." Susan and I were getting along much better, and she remained a great sounding board for all that I was going through with the band. But my wife had developed her own life, and Cody and I were no longer the priorities we had once been. The kids were growing fast, and bored at home she'd set herself up as a jewelry designer under the name Susan Harris, her mother's maiden name. As we became wealthier and she began to enjoy the pleasures of jewelry shopping, she studied some expensive trinkets and thought, "I could make that." With my emotional and financial support, she took a course at UCLA and the Gemstone Institute of America and became a goldsmith, a course that proved to be an affirmation of her talent and abilities. She set up an office at home and honed her skills until she felt confident enough to offer her goods up for sale. I was all for it and invested heavily in the business to give her enough capital to get started. "My wife makes jewelry and sells it instead of buying it," I'd tell my friends proudly. "How bad can that be?" Now, when I was away on tour for months on end, Susan was busy running her own company, making and designing beautiful, one-of-a-kind gemstone pieces and selling them through Neiman Marcus stores. Within a very short time, she became the largest jewelry vendors and was able to take on a full-time staff. My only complaint was that I could never reach Susan when I wanted to talk to her. She was transformed almost overnight from being a housewife, always there when I called, to traveling all over the states to gemstone conventions, living out of hotel rooms like me and wearing power suits. My little blue-eyed blonde Susan was suddenly Ivana Trump. The transformation was more than a little unsettling. Being back on the road brought its usual sexual temptations, tenfold in fact, because of our new rock legend status. Fortunately, everyone was now married with kids, and the baseline had been moved. Don and Glenn had issued various commandments sent down from the mountains. For this very high-profile tour, there would be no drink or drugs, so as not to tempt Joe, and there would be no womanizing, because wives and children were now traveling with us. No more third encores. However, sometimes when I'd pass Glenn's room, food service trays of red wine would be evident, or there'd be a telltale pungent aroma in the hallway. All of us were faced with an ongoing daily opportunity to be unfaithful. The video crew even put together a film called The Eagle's Greatest Tits, which showed the astonishing array of breasts revealed nightly for our delectation by women in the audience. There was always some chick up on her boyfriend's shoulders dancing and singing along who was happy to show us her finest assets then and later. Those sort of offers weren't confined to the fans nor to the groupies who hung around, ever hopeful. They were also forthcoming from the stewardess, waitress, bar staff, and various hanger-ons who became our camp followers, even at the affluent high-end level. I knew what beasts lurked out there with women, and I knew the battles I was going to be facing. I had burdened myself, quite deservingly, with massive amounts of guilt in the 80s for my earlier bad behavior. I wanted to prove, not only to Susan and to the band, but also to myself that I wasn't the same guy anymore. I had grown through, out, and beyond that stuff. I made a conscious decision to take things along with me that I could use to transcend those temptations. I really tried to find a way to face the same challenges and prove my own merit to myself. Using a technique I employed when I quit smoking, I told myself, I've fallen victim to this before. I've tasted all of its delights, I know what it is, and I also know the damage it causes, so I'm not going to taste it again. I read spiritually enlightening books, having discovered that it is really hard for an animal, such as raw sexual desire, to exist in the presence of something high and spiritual. It dwindles and slithers back into the darkness. I used to leave books lying around in my hotel or dressing room, on the plane or backstage, and whenever I was presented with temptation, I'd pick one up and start reading it. I even handed one at the end of the tour to a young stewardess on our private plane, who was particularly persistent, and from whom I'm proud to say I rejected all advances. "Read this and have a happy life," I told her with a smile. Another technique I employed was to practice my guitar playing in the dead time between gigs and sound checks. There'd often be up to 20 hours a day to fill, and I'd make a point of playing 6 or 7 hours every day. Concentrating on my finger work really diverted my attention from what else my hands could have been doing. I also spent a lot of time emailing the kids, faxing, making calls, keeping busy. Most of all, for 9 glorious months beginning in January of 1995, I had O.J. Simpson to thank. His televised trial on CNN gripped the entire nation. It also served as a wonderful device against temptation. One of our tour jokes became, "Sorry, honey, can't you right now. OJ's about to take the stand." Employing these various techniques, I managed to keep my hands clean and Susan happy. There were some unexpected experiences too, like meeting the President of the United States. Don had been a big supporter of Bill Clinton when he was governor, and he arranged a benefit concert in Beverly Hills for his re-election campaign. Susan, my mother, Jessie, and Rebecca all came with me and met Bill and Hillary, both of whom were extremely charismatic. Barbra Streisand sang, and I met Sharon Stone, which was a personal high. David Geffen was there, now a film mogul through his partnership with Steven Spielberg. I was pleased to see him. In the short time David's company managed us before we moved with Irving to Fort Wayne, he had always been extremely gracious to me. I longed for a return to such integrity. In gratitude for our election support, when our tour came to Washington, we were invited to the White House to see the Oval Office and have lunch with the First Lady. It was a great honor, and protocol dictated that we should give the Clintons something to express our thanks. The gift the God selected, however, was not quite what I might have chosen. Clinton had an endorsement deal with Takamine, the Japanese guitar makers, which meant that every year we were given scores of guitars to autograph and give away for personal auctions or charity events. One of these was now destined for Bill Clinton. At various times I suggested we try and make a deal with Martin, Fender, or Gibson instead. We're an all-American band. We're meant to be the quintessential all-American band. I thought we shouldn't be handing out cheap Japanese guitars, least of all to the President of the United States. It should be a special handmade commemorative American Gibson with the Eagles logo inlaid into it. No matter what I said, the deal remained. It was even featured on their website endorsing their products, complete with a photo of him holding one and smiling inanely. When we arrived at the White House, Irving had a Takamine guitar that we all had signed. As we neared the Oval Office, it was handed to me to present it to the President. Normally, Don and Glenn would have been only too happy to step into the limelight. I was highly embarrassed by the nature of our gift. I didn't even really know what we were doing there. I wasn't a particular fan of the Clintons, and other than playing a few benefits for him, I'd had nothing to do with supporting them. Now suddenly they wanted me to step up to the plate. Bill Clinton is given the most elegant paintings and furniture, jewelry, china, and ornaments, which end up in the Smithsonian for posterity, and all we could manage was this? I found myself red-faced and tongue-tied, standing in the Oval Office, in front of JFK's very own desk, having the dishonor of telling Bill Clinton how much the Eagles would like to give him this special signed guitar. I wanted to say, "Hey Bill, we heard you play saxophone, so we thought you might like to try a guitar instead." But after the Cranston incident, I hardly dared open my mouth. We did so many benefit gigs, it sometimes seemed like almost all the concerts we did were for free. If it wasn't for some politician or other, it was for Glenn's golf charity, Don's Walden Woods project, or his campaign to preserve the land beneath his Santa Monica home, a project Joe and I had dubbed Save Henley's View. A great deal of money was being taken out of every ticket each night to go to their personal charities, and after a while I came up with an idea I thought everyone would jump at. In my opinion, who better to benefit from the sort of generosity we had been showing people we hardly knew than the people who had worked for us so loyally for so long? We could do one night's gig for the crew and give them $1 million or so to split between them by way of a thank you. That sort of money would allow them to take care of themselves in their old age. We could make these guys happy for the rest of their lives. Instead of helping our boys, we continued to raise millions for the band's various pet causes, which gave us maximum publicity and some undoubted tax advantages, while our hard-working crew continued slogging it. Well, that's the end of Chapter 17. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 17 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.